Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first episode at EcoMadres Investigates. My name is Karin Stein, and I'm Iowa Field Organizer for Moms Clean Air Force and EcoMadres in Iowa. Did I just say that? At EcoMadres, we address key environmental issues affecting the health of Latino children and families who are disproportionately impacted by air pollution, climate change, and exposure to toxic chemicals. We are a community of mothers or mamas, abuelas, comadres, passionately and tirelessly working together with a focus on together to push for equitable solutions that will improve the health and well being of our families. Across the country, we are seeing wildfires that last longer, burn hotter, and are becoming more severe than in past times. Wildfires emit toxic air pollutants that threaten as many as 7.5 million children living in the US every single year. Children are especially vulnerable to those effects because, as we at Ecomadres like to point out, they're not just miniature adults. Children have distinct metabolisms and they breathe air, much more air relative to their body size and weight than adults. These pollutants emitted by wildfires can be up to 10 times more dangerous than smog from vehicle emissions and industry, and they can impact children who are not living in the immediate vicinity of a wildfire. These past 2 weeks, California has experienced devastating wildfires that have torn through communities, putting children and families at risk and destroying thousands of homes and livelihoods. These wildfires have far reaching effects. And in today's conversation, we would like to explore groundbreaking findings on short term and long term impacts of wildfires on Latinos and underserved communities across California. And we would like to hear from experts about how we can support equitable strategies to address these inequities and strengthen resilience within Latino communities. But before we jump in, it's important to acknowledge this moment on a very personal level. I would like to express my deepest condolences and solidarity to everyone affected by the recent and ongoing fires across California that have claimed nearly 50 lives and have left tens of thousands of people displaced from their homes. And there are additional background events playing out across the country that complicate things even further, especially for Latino families. As I introduce our guests, I would like to offer to each of them the space to share a few words. And I know some of them have been affected and their families by these fires and all kinds of recent devastating events. So I would like to bring to the table, as we say, it's a figurative table, our first guest today, Sonia Diaz, co-founder of Latina Futures 2050 Lab. She's a civil rights attorney and a policy advisor, renowned for her pioneering work in advancing equitable representation and opportunities for Latinas. Sonia, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this conversation.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the mujeres who have continued to advocate for healthy communities. In terms of the invitation for a moment of acknowledgement, I am a fourth generation Angelino on my father's side, and as a little girl would go hiking with my family in Eden Canyon, and my father's side of the family is very much in that fire zone as I am. There is devastating loss. These fires have been unique in that they have been rural, tens of thousands of structures, acres burned. But what I want to say is, Karen, and I think you alluded to this disaster is occurring under very difficult political circumstances where immigrants, immigrant families, people that identify as BIPOC are not comfortable trying to get aid for fear of enforcement actions, including immigration enforcement. And so there is a lot of loss that is occurring, and there are huge systemic barriers in Los Angeles right now in terms of relief and recovery, especially for Latino and mixed status families. And so I really hope that we keep these intersections in mind as we grieve and we talk about the path forward towards recovery. Thank you.
Sonia, you really chose the appropriate word, which is we're grieving. The communities are grieving. And now I'd like to bring to the table Isaias Hernandez, an environmentalist, educator, a creative, devoted to improving environmental literacy through content creation, storytelling, and public engagements. Isaias, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much again for having me, Karen. It's honestly such a privilege to be in this conversation and also really reflect back the last 2.5 weeks and I think a lot of people can confirm here, as a first generation Latino here, like people are still processing, people are still trying to figure out what's happening, and people are also trying to figure out their next plan in our political sphere of news that's unfolding every day. And I think that the wildfire is another reminder for our communities and Latino communities that only the people can save the people, and that we have to be able to be having the resources and the resilient structures to not just create safety nets, but also making sure that we know our neighbors as a climate solution.
Indeed, yes, thank you very much. And I would like to bring now to our table Antonieta Cadiz. She is Deputy Executive Director of Climate Power en Acción. Hello again, Antonieta, good to see you. This is a project of climate power focused on reaching and mobilizing Latinos and Latinas on climate action and a fairer, cleaner, and healthier economy. Antonieta, bienvenida.
Hola, Karin, ¿cómo estás? Qué gusto de verte. Thank you very, very much for the invitation. I appreciate the time here and the interesting conversation. I think for me, it's how we communicate what is happening in California. This intersection that was mentioned, the people component that Isaias was mentioning, and how we communicate this on a personal level, on a relatable level, and connect that with climate.
Yes, thank you. And you're an expert at that. I have known your work for so many years. I would like to direct my very first question to Sonia. Sonia, you co-founded and directed the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Institute, the first comprehensive think tank within the University of California system dedicated to addressing the policy needs of the nation's second largest racial ethnic group, Latinos. Along with the UCLA Center for Neighborhood Knowledge, the Institute has recently released analyses that examine the short and long-term consequences of the wildfires on Latino communities, focusing on health vulnerabilities, economic disruptions, and gaps in preparedness. And trying to keep your response to no more than 5 minutes, can you please share some of the key findings and the importance of addressing these disparities?
Absolutely. I want to highlight both the work of Dr. Sylvia Gonzalez, who leads this research enterprise, both under the hat of LPPI, which I co-founded and directed for 7 years, and the Center for Neighborhood Knowledge, which is directed by Professor Paul Ong at UCLA. What their recent research, and I call this rapid response research, has done is it's elongated research that we had worked collaboratively on during COVID-19. And I think that it's important when we think about the intersections of environmental justice and climate to integrate public health and then also social mobility and economic status. So, what is occurring in Los Angeles because of these wildfires, and it's plural. This is a huge region with 10 million people that live in this county, almost half of whom identify as not as Latino. And what is important there is that this is in many ways a majority Latino community, though this is happening 5 years after COVID-19 hammered this region and saw disparate impacts on the mortality and infection rates that really came down to a Latino issue because of their occupational segregation as essential workers, because of poor land use planning and structural and systemic inequities that rendered access to care, safe, clean communities, access to transportation, green space, access to food, all impediments for people because of their racial ethnic background in this metro area. So as we come into 2025, there are multiple fires that have important contours for understanding geographically. The first fire was the Palisades Fire, and that occurred in the city of Los Angeles in an affluent, predominantly non-Hispanic white community. But what Dr. Gonzalez and her team identified was that despite Latinos only representing 7% of the evacuees of the Palisades Fire, they were over 30% of the workers. So just like COVID-19, these fires have a lot to do with the impacts in terms of our labor force, but also the health and environmental impacts that are secondary, or in many ways are the things that come along with crises. And so these things also include looking at the Silmar Fire, which is in the San Fernando Valley. You're looking at a Latino community, so both in terms of residents and evacuees, but also workers. Then we go to the Eden Fire, which is very close to where I grew up and where I've spent most of my time in the region. That is a multi-ethnic, multiracial community, including unincorporated parts of the county like Altadena. What's important here is understanding that not all fires here are equal in terms of relief and recovery, because of who is in charge of emergency preparedness, but also because of the systemic issues that render some people unable to get the information, to get the relief, and to get the recovery, oftentimes on purpose. Where Dr. Gonzalez's research, I think, really makes a profound impact is on this idea of displacement. She's presenting an idea not just of displacement in terms of homes. Again, tens of thousands of structures have burned down. We don't know how many homes, and of those structures, how many were multifamily homes. Los Angeles is the epicenter of the nation's crisis of people experiencing homelessness. The state has a housing crisis. That's one part of displacement. The other part of displacement is job displacement. And that's where this research really gets to the heart of how many jobs, because of the occupational segregation of Latino jobs in landscaping, in domestic work, in retail and hospitality, you're seeing just an outsized disparate impact on the livelihoods of the majority population of this metropolitan region. I want to add that these households and these workers are in their most productive years. The last piece of displacement, and that's where we bring in the intersectionality, and you really see the cross-cultural aspect of these fires, the displacement of communities. And you're seeing this in beautiful ways in terms of mutual aid and mutual relief of responding. But I want to highlight that Altadena, which is part of the Eden Fire area, is a historic place of Black life for the region. This is a place where African American families for generations were able to purchase homes, transition them as legacy homes over generations, open small businesses. And so this destruction is really difficult in terms of thinking about displacement of that cultural and social fabric. So again, when we think about these fires, they're not all equal. It's not about necessarily where people live, it's about the disruption. Finally, what's really important, in addition to the layer of COVID-19, despite the gains of the Affordable Care Act, and Latino families being able to get insurance in ways that they were not able to previous, Latinos are still the most uninsured racial ethnic group in the country, and that is true of California. So access to care is a huge barrier. The second thing that's important is that Latinos already in the county live in places that are twice as likely to have higher pollution and air quality issues. So when we think about the remnants of this fire that are going to persist, there's going to have a disparate impact on communities that were already dealing with substantially higher levels of pollution that lead to chronic disease. And our public policy regime needs to be able to respond to that and support families bare minimum relief and recovery, but also accurate and culturally nuanced information in real time. Thank
Yeah,
you.
absolutely. What you touch upon is so, so important and so multifaceted. As a matter of fact, something else comes to mind to add to your theme of displacement. Um, and it has to do with mental health, the internal displacement that happens in trauma, that and populations that have already gone through multiple traumas. Every time they face a new emergency, they have to activate something in themselves to let that previous self behind and start a new self. And that's a form of displacement that leaves deep, deep exhaustion and mental health issues that are needed to rebuild. So that's another aspect that came to mind as you spoke. I'd like to turn to Isaiah's. Isaiah, as a storyteller and content creator, you have devoted your career to bringing intersectional environmental education to all. These research findings underscore the interesting vulnerabilities, including higher exposure to air pollution. We know that the impacts of air pollution are not distributed evenly. Communities already impacted by environmental racism, and that's something that Sonia addressed, are disproportionately burdened by unhealthy air. And other vulnerable communities, including children, older adults, pregnant people, outdoor workers. And isn't it ironic that these are the outdoor workers that we're going to rely on to rebuild? Just as a side comment. And also the firefighters. All of these people are hit harder when wildfires burn. Children, as mentioned earlier, breathe faster than adults, and their small lungs are still developing. That's another enormous difference compared to adult metabolisms. Children with allergies, asthma, or chronic health issues may have more trouble breathing during wildfires. We're also seeing a greater risk of displacement with tens of thousands of Angelenos who have already lost their homes. And again, Sonia addressed that very eloquently. Can you please talk to us about the intersectionality of these compounded climate threats? Why underestimating intersectionality is so important in how we respond to climate threats?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to recognize that diversity is what gives to a healthy, functioning society, rather than upholding uniformity and a monocultural mindset. So I think it's important to understand that, more than 55% of Latino Americans today live in states that are already experiencing serious effects of climate change, California and Texas and Florida. But for this case in California, I think it's important to understand that many of these communities of color, and like my own upbringing, living nearby toxic facilities, living nearby noise pollution sites, it not just generates air pollution that is bad for health, but it's also affecting your mental health. So, right, there's a polycyclic aromatic, I believe, hydrocarbon that has been shown to found that when these chemicals are released from industrial sites or they're burned, from different types of materials, they can cause brain damage. This is like includes memory loss, confusion, dementia. And, a lot of these young people that are exposed and vulnerable to these issues, have to go to school. And most of the times they are in public schools where there is not a lot of resources to provide students with either learning disabilities or learning developmental issues that are happening. And so this becomes, right, an educational issue if you don't believe in climate change, because people need to understand that if your kid deserves equitable education and they have barriers due to their environment. And the second thing I'd love to say is that there's been state data that has showed that around 60% of our health is determined by our environment and 30% is by our zip code. So I think it's important to know that, you have a higher chance of developing health related illnesses because of your environment versus this idea of like, oh, it's based on your genetics, it's based on your ancestors. That's why you have, asthma. That's why you have high cholesterol. That's why you have brain developmental issues. So I think it's important that when we start to unravel these types of topics, that it's important on that end. I think being on the front lines from a digital media creator sense, but also as someone that had to evacuate my own family in Silmar, I think it was very scary to know that, a lot of Latino communities were trying to understand this outweighs of trying to either protect their home and their safety or risk leaving and having to face with immigration, police. And I think that's something of those heightened fears where I think environmental justice really provides a pathway to work together with migrant justice groups and social justice groups, because like Sonia was saying, that, you know, my dad himself like is a gardener, right? And he has clients in Altadena that he completely lost. So, you know, in order for him to remake that income, not only does he have to put himself in different situations, but he's also having to work. And everyone knows that if you have immigrant parents, it's very hard to tell them not to work during a climate disaster. The best thing that I was able to offer is to make sure that, you know, they were relocated to my brother's homes with my sister-in-law. But it was also this frustrating thing of having to make sure and to understand to them why they shouldn't go out to them from a health perspective, that if they were having to go out, to wear an N95 mask. The other thing that we also don't know that's happening is just the water quality levels and the soil levels. A lot of people online on Instagram have reached out to me, which are typically parents that are finding out this information about wildfires, is, can my children go outside and play? And, you know, there hasn't actually been a lot of research right now, and there's currently research being conducted on the soil levels in different cities that where the wildfires happen, and also in central cities where a lot of the smog was pushed. And a lot of the studies right now, as they're being generated, a lot of the researchers would advise that their parents do not take them out, just because we don't know how contaminated the soil is going to be and what this remediation effect is going to happen for these communities. So I think that when we're looking at this broader landscape of Latinos not understanding or not thinking themselves as environmentalists, I think we have to really reframe the question and say people are the environment. So Latinos being able to have a rich cultural understandings of their home countries, their landscapes, their communities, their friendships, their businesses, that is a part of environmentalism. And I think we often try to silo them out, or we try to present information that sometimes may be a bit difficult for them to comprehend. And I think that, you know, language accessibility is one of those key solutions to help provide some resolutions, but also this sense of safety security net, as a lot of communities, and we know based on political views and why people have voted differently in the last few years, especially with Latino communities, is this sense of institutional betrayal, governmental betrayal. And I think it's important of how do we mend this type of city, social, and housing governance to make sure that these communities are not just talked about through the immigration lens, but they're also talked about from the economic lens, from the housing lens, of what they contribute and all the work that they continue to do. So I think, as we're learning more about these wildfires and the long-term impacts, I don't think that we have a system that necessarily is going to treat this. And I think it's going to further exacerbate more inequities that we're going to see. And so this requires a lot of us in our communities, whether or not we are experts in certain fields or we are, to really step up and to provide that information, because it is very sad to see that, even when I was experiencing wildfires, receiving hundreds of messages from people that were displaced from the Palisades, from the Eaton fire to Hearst fire, and telling me, what do I do? What can I do? Is truly saddening, because I think that how did we get to a place where we have people online that are being relied on more than our city responses, our community responses, and we have to be able to really reconnect those dots and to bring ourselves together, not just virtually, but also in physical persons, for that safety net.
Yes, you weave, as a true intersectionalist, you weave these things together beautifully. And let me just say, on a very personal level, as the mother of 3 women about your age, we at EcoMadres are particularly grateful for your generation, because you, just by your age, are an intersectional presence. You understand the older generation and the cultures that were brought with them, and you understand this new country that and you may be right in the middle between those, and your voice and your vision is so important. And so thank you so much on a very personal level. Let's switch on that topic of information that Isaiah's just touched upon. Antonieta, I'd like to switch to you, because I know communication and how and how truth is shared is very important to you. We have seen an influx of misinformation in the context of all of this, the spreading of false information and outright lies around the wildfires, and we know this can have life or death consequences. First responders can be negatively affected, emergency aid can be slowed down, and impacted families can have a difficult time making decisions, which is what Isaiah's just alluded to. What do I do? These messages. In just this first week of a new administration, we are seeing dangerous and reckless rollbacks on clean air and climate protections, and people are being placed in positions of authority who deny the reality of increasingly intense extreme weather events, from hurricanes to wildfires. So please tell us, what would you recommend? How can we protect our communities from harmful misinformation? What tools are available to us? And how can we respond to these attacks on climate progress?
Karin, thank you for the question. Believe me, from the bottom of my heart, I would like to answer. The answer is telling people this is not true. This is what is true. I would like the answer to be as simple as that, but we all know here that that is not the case. People don't like to feel they are wrong. People don't like to feel ashamed for things that they believe. So that is the core of why misinformation and disinformation is so successful. And the problem is that in the universe of misinformation and disinformation, you have climate disinformation, you have immigration disinformation, education. It's just too broad. So I would say first, one of the keys is to identify in this big universe what is climate disinformation. When we are talking about climate disinformation specifically, for example, on an extreme weather event, how you classify or identify climate disinformation, that's the first step. And from there, which is a big universe in itself, what are the most harmful and prevalent messages that are circulating and multiplying? And for that, of course, you use polling, you use your network to just identify and collaborate with different organizations that are working specifically on climate disinformation. So that's the first step. And then you pick your battles, because you will find that there is a whole universe of climate disinformation messages. So you just need to pick your battle in terms of the importance, the prevalence, etc., the trends. I would say the second thing is the message itself. Of course, we have talked about this on extreme weather events. There is a lot of speculation. So how do you present the message, and what tools do you use? And I would say the first thing that is most important is fact-based information that people can really trust with trusted sources. So put that out there to counter the disinformation and misinformation messages. As important as the message and the fact-based information that you can put out there after you identify the misinformation and disinformation is the medium. What medium are you using to do that? And we all know that for a long time, traditional media has been the way for us to communicate what is true, what sources we can trust, etc. But our society is changing. The way we communicate is changing. And traditional media now is not the only way where we can communicate this. We need to consider what is happening on the digital world. We need to consider what is trending on social media. We need to consider not only that, but what is most appealing for people. So when you're scrolling in your phone, what content will you choose? So the format is also very relevant. The package you use to distribute this message. And I would say, finally, as important as all the 3 points that I just mentioned are the messengers. And I coincido plenamente with you, Karen, when you talk to Isaias about how relevant is the message that he's convening how the intersectionality is so important between generations, because the trusted messengers today are very different from the messengers from yesterday. And we need to understand that, and we need to build relationships with these messengers so they help us counter disinformation. And I am talking about creators, and of course, I am talking about experts, community leaders, local leaders. Um, we all need to collaborate. This is not a fight that we will win alone. This is a fight that we will win together. And in order to do that, we need to use every element we have in our toolbox to make it happen.
Thank you, Antonieta. Absolutely agreed with you. And again, I'm glad you brought it up. EcoMadres and Moms Clean Air Force, we are honored to work with the generation that is carrying the main burden. We learn a lot from that generation, and not least of which is how to communicate in today's world. So let's turn to the last question. And this is a question I'm directing to all of you, though I would like to invite Sonia to answer first. Let's go in the same order in which we answered the previous question. So Sonia, Isaias, and Antonieta. It is clear that addressing these systemic disparities is essential to protect the health, safety, and livelihoods of Latinos and other historically marginalized communities during current and future crises. As we look to the road ahead in recovery and rebuilding, how can we urge our policymakers to craft and support equitable disaster response strategies that address the compounded risks Latino communities face and that you have all addressed? How can we help our communities become more resilient in the face of a warming climate? So maybe a couple of minutes each of you, Sonia.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this. Again, this is really framed and informed by the global pandemic that was COVID-19 and Los Angeles County having been the epicenter during the first phase of that. What we learned is that government cannot deploy information, resources, and care at the level necessary for communities that have been historically excluded. And for that, the role of civil society organizations, nonprofits, community-based organizations, whether it is community clinics, state hospitals, labor unions, nonprofits, mutual aid groups, those are the trusted messengers. And in the aftermath of the fires and the devastation, there remains this continued thread that these entities, non-governmental, are the ones that are able to deploy necessary relief, aid, support to meet people's basic needs. And so the government really needs to start looking at this sector as a partner, investing in it, recognizing that it is a necessary element for keeping residents safe, communities healthy, and the economy moving. The second thing that I think is really important, and this is both the political climate and challenges that we are facing under the Donald Trump administration and the proliferation of climate change that has increased the veracity and frequency of climate-related crises. We need to protect the economic footing of vulnerable families. This includes mixed status families, households that have an elderly tío or tía or abuela or young people. Latino families, like Asian American families, they're the youngest of any racial ethnic demographic. They have multi-generational household formations. They're critical to the small business sector in many of these communities that are most at risk for climate disaster. And the government needs to think about protecting those assets, whether it is through estate planning, pro and low bono legal services, insurance regimes that ensure that people have the support necessary for business interruption, You know, a lot of small business owners lost everything in these fires. They were working out of their homes. Or in the case of the Eden fire, you know, there were multiple families that lived in close proximity and their businesses were there and everything is gone. And maybe they have workers' comp insurance or other business insurance, but not business interruption. The government needs to come in and really stabilize those and those people, those communities. Because when we think about recovery, we really need to reimagine how we strengthen the very valuable assets of these communities, which are the people there. And they should not be displaced from their legacy and their future and their contributions. The last thing that I think is really important is we have a silo of information whereby people do not trust government. In many ways, they don't trust mainstream media. There is conflicting information. And so there's a need to reinforce local news and ethnic press and newspaper on digital and traditional channels. So much of how people got their information, in addition to reaching out to leaders like Isaias, was local news. It was not the government, it was not other types of channels. So we need to reinforce things that can really be able to convey accurately in timely ways, in culture and in language, information for all Americans. And I would say that that's an investment in our future, and that's an investment in us being able to get back to a place of belonging.
Thank you so much, Sonia. You addressed, you know, this theme that people aren't trusting government. I would like to ask Isaiah's and the need for government to understand that community organizations and the trusted voices in communities matter, and that the government needs to pay attention. But that's precisely the challenge. So, Isaiah's, what are some ways in which we communicate with our lawmakers about this need that Sonia is addressing? I think you're muted.
Whoops, sorry. I think the most important thing is reinvesting in solutions-based journalism in traditional media outlets. We know that solutions have always existed and they continue to exist. And I think that when it comes from a governmental and policy standpoint, there's been a lot of solutions that have happened in different towns where wildfires have happened, and what showcased from just the institutional level, but from the grassroots level, you know, one of those simple fixes was, you know, planting native vegetation to ensure that there are climate resilient ecosystems. But the second thing was actually developing a system in collaboration with the community of their own alerting system. As you know, that, you know, there's been a lot of really unique pieces where certain people were able to report locally in their own communities, and because of Facebook groups or other digital media platforms, they were able to escape and actually save their lives and save their animals. You know, I think on my end, what I really emphasized from governmentals and also political figures is to really work with us to create unique messaging that isn't too corporate, but is actually very much rooted in facts. A lot of the times I've worked with nonprofits to really discuss the science behind the fires and explaining like the situation of how it relates to climate change. And I think that's been very useful to see a lot of strong collaborations come. But I think governmental agencies really need to understand that, you know, a lot of people today can sniff and see through PR. They could see through these polished statements. And I think a lot of the times what people are looking for is the raw conversations that are coming out from people's hearts, from their minds, what they really think. And so I think it's important that how do we really balance both the political responses, but also the emotional responses that people are feeling. I know that the other thing I would really suggest is that governments work with a lot of mental health experts to talk about climate emotions. You know, one of the biggest things I recognize is people telling me, like, what is this feeling that I'm feeling? What is a word to what I'm feeling? And a lot of it was rooted in ecological grief, or it was eco anxiety, because a lot of them have told me where, like, you know, they know that they didn't physically lose any loved one, but they mentally and physically lost their safety. And so I think it's important that we are able to during this time where people are also physically not feeling safe, whether that they lost their job, their home, that we also check in with them mentally and provide resources that people can talk about that is also translated to Latino communities. Because I think that when people are able to situate themselves with a word that describes their experiences, that allows them to validate their emotions, but also allows them to really not think that there's something mentally wrong with them. And I think that's something where, we have to be able to have direct responses to those types of pieces. And I think the last thing is having, from mutual aid groups, a disaster relief emergency fund for communities, and working with organizers or organizations to, have those instead of relying always on FEMA, which is sometimes can take a long process to take. And I know that a lot of communities don't really have the time to always just sit down and apply and prove all this identification. Meanwhile, they also need to work a 9-to-5 job that, that's not really guaranteed for them. So I think it's a lot about collaboration today, and that requires a lot of us to look inward than outward.
Thank you so much, Isaiah. So, Antonieta, I'm going to summarizing what Sonia and Isaiah said. One of the central themes is we know what we need governments to see. How do you and I build that bridge to the lawmakers to communicate to them so that they notice what we know our communities need? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, first, I'm going to say a key word, and it's not going to be a surprise for anyone, is visibility. And here I want to commend EcoMadres because, for example, I was in Congress 2 weeks ago, and one of the things I noticed in the doors of some members' offices were post-its with different messages, and they were for actually EcoMadres. And the message was, help us save the climate progress that we achieved during these last 4 years. And it was different messages from children and from mothers. And they stayed there for a long time. So that is one way to make it really visible, to just show up in those offices and bring the conversation to them and be memorable while doing it. And I think an organization like EcoMadres, for example, does a fantastic job doing that. So that's one, visibility. And the second one, which I think Sonia and Isaias touch on, is intersectionality. Of course, extreme weather and extreme weather events in general, we have all the attention for, I would say, a couple of weeks where the disaster is on and everyone is responding, and we have all the help there, like all the attention and the pictures, etc. But then what happens? And here the intersectionality is really important, because when you face an extreme weather event, you lose your job or probably expose your job to danger, because you have to rebuild, you have to focus on that. And how can you focus on work and rebuilding at the same time? Your health and mental health are compromised. And then you have to, how do you get the money to recover? I mean, you have to ask for loans if you don't have resources. Then your immigration status come in. You don't want to ask for help, or if you ask for help, maybe you cannot access the resources or the loans you need. So there is a combination of things that are all intersectional. And whenever people talk about climate and talk about extreme weather and how it's not a kitchen table issue, it's not a priority issue in pollings. And we know members of Congress or local representatives, they like to look at polls.
Antonieta, let me jump in because we've reached the limit of our time. I'm so sorry, but let's continue this conversation. I really appreciate all of you being here today. And I would like to just close by giving several resources. And one of them is to continue the conversation right after we close down here. Now's the time to come together and to build systems that are fair and resilient. Join us by using your voice to advocate for a strong, clean air and climate policy at the local, state, and federal levels. The speakers just communicated several times how important the local level is. Everything we do to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions now can help reduce the impact of wildfires in the future. And we must remain committed to this action. Not taking action is not an option. On the screen, we would like to pull up 2 QR codes. And one is for you to join our community at EcoMadres and to stay in contact with us and how you can take action through us. And the second is a link to be able to read UCLA's full report for more information. And there are numerous resources to support our communities in recovering and rebuilding. And we'd like to point out 2 partners. Extreme Weather Survivors is hosting a community Q&A on Slack right now as we speak. It's an ongoing program. And we would like you to join Extreme Weather Survivors right now to ask your questions. There are experts, there are medical experts, there are community organizing experts, people who can answer the questions that we weren't able to include in our program today. So Extreme Weather Survivors on Slack right now. And then I think you pulled up, right? We just saw the bit.ly link to that. And then Sachamama education series on wildfires. What an enormously important resource. This is a course that will explore essential strategies and techniques for coping with wildfire trauma and prioritizing emotional health. And this crucial information and tips for staying safe during fire and evacuation procedures are included in Sachamama, and practices for returning home safely. We talked about this, what's happening to the ground, what are we inhaling, what are the chemicals and the dangers. And Sachamama is also addressing long-term recovery needs, and the link is here. And we thank you all for joining us. And this episode, our very first episode of EcoMadres Investigates, and it's just the beginning of our work ahead. Special thank you all, these fantastic speakers today. And please tune in with Sachamama and right now have your questions answered at Extreme Weather Survivors. Thank you so much for being here today.